complexity. As a leader, we all are dealing with complexity, perhaps more and more. Today, we're going to talk about how to crack complexity with a process and a plan. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Glad to have you. I'm your host, Kevin Eikenberry. Our guest today is David Benjamin. I'll tell you about him, and then we'll dive in. Okay. So David is the chief architect at Syntegrity's implementation of the complexity formula and regularly guides leaders and their teams through their application of the formula, helping them get to decisions and actions in days, no matter the industry, type of challenge, or nature of the organization. In this capacity, he has become a trusted advisor to Fortune 500 companies and government leaders on how to organize for complexity and find traction in the face of the intractable. He frequently speaks on a wide range of topics related to complexity, effective and efficient problem solving, and human dynamics and systems. He spends most of the rest of his time and energy on writing, family, long distance running, and cracking cryptic crosswords, and apparently writing intros that use lots of C words. David and his wife Angie live near Toronto, where he's joining me from today, and they have 3 children, incredibly talented daughters, whom he loves equally. He's also the co-author of a brand new book. And when I mean brand new, as the day this is released, it is like brand new, and it is called Cracking Complexity: The Breakthrough Formula for Solving Just About Anything Fast, with David Komlos. David, welcome.
Yes.
Glad to have you here.
Glad to be here. Been looking forward to this conversation.
So tell us about your journey. How did you end up being a dude that teaches people how to solve complex problems?
I actually come from a math and computer science background. So I think probably my parents would say from early childhood, I was a mathematician and I liked solving problems. Being the youngest of 4 with 3 older sisters, that's probably part of why I liked solving problems. But for me, if I look at everything I've done, the common thread is problem solving. I don't like to see something that isn't solved, doesn't have a solution, without sitting down and trying to wrap my head around it.
Hence the need to do crossword puzzles, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
So, a lot of books come across my desk, and for a variety of reasons, including for people who are pitching to get on the podcast. And when your book came across, it saying Cracking Complexity, a breakthrough formula for solving just about anything fast. I'm thinking, I think everyone would like to be better at that. So talk about let's start with what's the big idea of the book? And then I want to dive into some of the great stuff that I found inside. So what's the big idea of the book?
I would say the big idea is probably that there's a shift going on in society. It's been going on for quite a while. Disruption of various technologies, various business models, as people shift from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. So it's happened with ride sharing, it's happened with hotel space. The book is basically describing a paradigm shift that everybody needs to make to start to understand that there's not a scarcity of talent in and around the organization. It's just been very hard to tap into. So because of the scarcity mindset, there are business models that exist that attract buyers by being the outsourcer of thinking, of deciding, of research, and so on. Mm-hmm. But as leaders we've worked with, as leaders in general, come to understand that there are ways now to tap into the talent in and around their ecosystem. They can find better solutions by doing that effectively. And not just that, but bake in change management and readiness for execution, mobilization of the right people into the process of actually solving the problem, instead of doing that as an afterthought.
So, yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that the book really starts to help us think about is that uh, you've got the ability, you've given us some ideas, and we're going to dive into them about how we can use our people differently and better and tap into some of the things that you've just described. So, if there was a word that I've used the most so far is the word complexity. I've used that word several times, both in my conversation as well as obviously the title of the book and in your bio. So tell me what's the difference between a complex problem and a complicated problem, and why does that matter?
Well, the terminology actually really matters a lot because I find it gives people clarity when we talk about this. So we differentiate complicated challenges and in fact simple challenges as well as being solved problems. So a simple problem is solved and anyone can solve it by executing the same solution. A complicated challenge is also a solved problem. You can reliably go execute the solution again, but the difference between simple and complicated is that you may need to bring in an expert who solved it before or knows how to execute the checklist to solve it. So that's important because complexity is categorically different. In the complex domain, there is no known solution. There's no repeatable solution. You can only know that you have found the right solution or a best solution or a good enough solution in retrospect. And so why that matters is what that means is each time you encounter a complex challenge, you need to solve it anew. You can't just reach back to what you did before to solve it.
Can't look back into the files. You can't go back mentally to your experience. You gotta look at that. So, and I know from reading the book that you would agree that we've got way more complex problems than we used to have, and hence the need for the book. You want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, whereas there's always been complexity, there's always been new things to figure out and solve. What's going on these days is things are happening so fast and changing so fast that, first of all, it's hard to separate challenges between complicated and complex because there's so many of them. Once you think that way and start to separate out the complicated from the complex, you realize how interconnected all the complexities are that you're facing. So if your market is being disrupted by Amazon and you're dealing with a workforce that's made up of millennials and have new wants and needs, and your customers' preferences and expectations are changing, it's not one of those things. It's those and many other things hitting you all at once.
And they're all connected, and they're also connected. And so how do you deal with, to your point, all of that complexity? Right. One of the things that you talk about early in the book, which people may have heard of, certainly if they have a math background, they may have heard of, but I think that you give us a new way to think about it, and it's the S-curve. So talk about what the S-curve is, but then tell us a little bit about how we ought to think about that perhaps differently than we've done in the past.
Well, it's easy to get really freaked out if you believe that to keep up with sort of exponential complexity, you have to find ways to make your organization exponential. But if you have any kind of basic understanding of exponents, they sort of keep doubling or tripling or accelerating on towards infinity. And there's absolutely no way to expect that you can keep up with that. What we espouse in the book, what our customers have done, what leaders we worked with have done, is realize that what you need is an S-curve leap. So you're traveling along on a linear trajectory. You realize there's a need for a change to get onto a new trajectory. So you don't have to change your curve completely and be on a new curve. You have to take a leap very quickly from trajectory A to trajectory B. And that requires an exponential or power leap. So that's the S-curve we're talking about.
So act, leap, act is the way that you describe it in the book. And in fact, that leads us to where I want to head, because the core of this book is your process. If as you assert, that complex problems they've not been solved, what we need is a process to help us solve them. And that's what the book, Cracking Complexity, does. And we're talking with David Benjamin, one of the authors of this brand new book. And so you talk about a 10-step model, and I know that we can't unpack all of the 10 steps in any great depth, but I would like you to walk us through the thought process, and then I want to dive into 2 or 3 of them if we can.
Okay, so just very top line. Believe it or not, I think the first step is just for leaders to recognize that they're facing something complex, not just complicated. That means I can't just hand this to someone else to solve for me, because they're going to be just as flummoxed by it as I am. So what I need to do is find a different approach to solve it. And that requires a mindset shift for any good leader. from sort of, I am in control, I've been hired to solve things for the organizations, I can figure this out on my own or with my team of executives around me. They need to actually cede control, hand that over to a larger group, recognize that I don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. I can't see all the facets of what's going on. I have an ecosystem that is experiencing it every day. And what I need to do is hand this over to my ecosystem, not the entire 5,000 or 10,000 people in my organization, but a cross section that represents all the perspectives I need to figure it out. So it starts there with that recognition.
So good news. If you're listening right now, you've got the first step. Like you sort of have got, we're giving you that new mindset perhaps, right? To help you start with step one. So first step is figure out, acknowledge, I think is the way you actually describe it.
Yeah.
This, you got a complex problem. So go ahead.
And then again, without going kind of step by step, the rest is about really identifying, the term is requisite variety, the right variety of people that collectively are necessary and sufficient to figure out the complexity. So before you actually bring that group together to figure things out, and just after you've recognized that you've got complexity, there's a step in there as well to formulate a great question. And so we say great question, it means all sorts of things. I know I've listened to some of your podcasts about great questions, but something that gives scope and a call to action and the aspirational goal statement and everything else that kind of characterizes the complexity you're trying to solve. Not just the complexity, but what success looks like when you've solved it.
Where the outcome is. Yep.
Right. So you get that group of people, you get that question, you bring them together, you give them a very, very effective way to, we call them collisions, to experience thousands of collisions very rapidly. So when we talk about collisions, it's people with other people, and not just each time I meet someone that's, that's a collision and that's enough. It's actually a very high quality interaction, which is captured and which brings people together playing roles that they don't normally play with each other.
It's interesting that you highlighted that one, and because that's actually one of the a couple of things I wanted to come back to. So the model is figure out, at a high level, figure out that you have in fact a complex problem, figure out what the big question is so people have context and direction, and then put the right people together. What else do you want to say about the big picture here before we dive into a couple of these items?
Well, I'm a strong believer of, I think it's step 8 around emergence, but first of all, iteration is required to get people, because people are human beings. They need to let go of some things. They need to feel like they've been heard. They need to vent their frustrations. So some of the gating that happens in the formula is about holding people back from trying to solve anything until they've reached a shared understanding.
Yeah.
I remember early years in business watching my father and his business partner having hour-long debates and knowing, because I like solving problems, as I was trying to decipher what was going on, they're not even talking about the same thing. They're not using the same language. And they can find resolution, but they're not resolved because they haven't actually solved the same thing that they thought they were each solving.
They were each trying to solve a different problem. They were trying to convince the other person of the problem without the other person really figuring it out.
Yeah, so shared understanding first is key. And so you actually literally have to hold people back from trying to solve things, because it feels like a waste of time to listen to people vent and to listen to people share their language, etc. But when you're dealing with variety, when you've got engineers and doctors and professionals and millennials and retirees, when you've really got variety talking to each other, there's so much language that gets in the way. And, we talk about this in the book as well, where a group of engineers can have a very, very efficient and fast conversation with each other. But as soon as you throw in one person from another profession, everybody needs to slow right down.
Yeah.
Line on language. Yeah.
So you actually highlighted one of the things I wanted to talk more about, which was putting people on this collision course, which I really, really like. So in fact, that's probably one of the things that will hang with me from the book, quite honestly. So talk more about what you mean by that. You started to go there. Say more about what that looks like and how we do that.
Well, so collisions, again, we didn't use the word interaction because that sounds too much like what happens all the time. Collisions are purposeful. You put people, and in fact, we don't sort of do one by one every pair of person meeting together and colliding personally in an isolated way. We do that in more of a group setting. So again, applying a principle that says you can only have productive interactions, conversations in groups of 6, 7, 8 people. We get to the point where people are into conversations of that size, and we have people playing various roles, and the roles are absolutely key. So there are people who are carrying the conversation and are expected to carry the conversation and own the conversation. Those people are talking to each other and deep into it, and they're in the trees. We then have a separate group of people playing a role called critic, and their job is to listen to the conversation that's going on and not talk. And that sounds easy, but it's a very difficult role for people to do and to be good at. So when a critic gets their opportunity to speak, we ask them to tell the people who've been having the conversation how they're doing. Are they on track? Is anyone steamrolling anyone else? Is somebody being more quiet than they should be? And the critics are able to see things that the people in the conversation just don't see. So they get a chance to talk.
Just like you with your dad and his partner, right?
That's right. That's right. And while they're speaking, an important rule is that the people in the conversation are not allowed or expected or required to respond. They're just there to listen now to the critique of their conversation. Then we turn the floor back over to them after our various critics have had their piece, and they continue a great conversation. There's a third group of people often in these conversations that are called observers, and they don't get the right to speak at all during the course of this entire conversation. And so you can imagine when we have the CEO of a food industry company sitting in the observer chair, and there's a conversation going on at the table about incentives or whatever it is, how hard it is to sit quietly and listen. And believe it or not, we get very deep thanks from people at the end for having been forced to do that, because they realize they never do that.
They never do it. One of the things I tell leaders all the time is that you should talk less and you should talk later. And you're basically forcing them to do that because we don't, right? Excellent.
Right.
Yep.
It's very hard. So just to bring it back to collisions, what I just described is 5 different kinds of collisions going on. So there are people in an equal conversation. There are people in a critiquing and conversing relationship. There are people in a listening to the critique and listening to the people having their conversation. And each one has a different dynamic. And each one diffuses information and brings new information into the group in different ways. So we go through a very high number of these things in a very short amount of time. And we'll have medical doctors and engineers at the end of the conversation, at the end of the encounter, at the end of the experience, saying, I don't know what just happened, but something magic happened. And I've actually got a really great anecdote, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, please.
Watched a participant who was in the critic chair, given her chance to speak in a conversation, I think it was about women and HIV/AIDS. And she had a brilliant idea, and she shared it with the group at the table that was having the conversation. When it was her turn to speak, they listened thoughtfully. When the conversation was returned to them, they picked up on that idea and they were very excited about it, to the point where one of the doctors at the end of the session said to the woman who had been the critic, that was a brilliant idea. I don't know where that came from, but thank you, because that just gave us what we needed. She came over to me afterwards and she said, I just want to tell you something. I have been saying that idea for years in groups that include all these people. It's just nobody's ever been listening before.
Never heard it, didn't value her, whatever, right? And so exactly. I think for everyone listening, I mean, I'm going to get sort of out, from a process perspective, I'm going to get outside of David's process and just tell you that I think one of the powers of what he's described here is this idea of putting people in roles because they don't get in those roles. And this helps to structure the way we think and the way we listen and the way we hear. And I think that's where there's power. And that's why I said, and no disrespect, David, to the rest of the book, that alone, I think, is well worth people picking up a copy of, which is just out now, if you're listening to us as we go live. Cracking Complexity, the breakthrough formula for solving just about anything fast. If you're watching, here's what it's going to look like. Yours will look fancier than mine because I have the early marketing copy. But anyway, there you have it in that regard. So one of the things that you talk about in a different step is this idea of changing the way people interact, which clearly the collision and the collision course does that. Anything else you want to say? Because at the end of the day, you got a complex problem, you got people involved, you're trying to get people to come to some conclusions. What else would you say about how to change the way that people interact throughout the process?
I think it hasn't been said explicitly in our conversation, but let me just say it. People being face-to-face in a room together is an important part of these interactions. And we've done some digital, of course, we all have meetings like this over communication platforms that allow for remote interaction. But there is something very different about putting human beings in the room together for conversation. So interactions in general and giving them a better kind of interaction forces them to set aside their work for a few days and come together to one place. And that's hard. And it's becoming increasingly hard with the amount of email and everything else that backs up when you step away from work for even an hour.
The interesting thing is that, as a person who's written a book called The Long Distance Leader, and as a person who leads a remote team, people might assume that I'm saying, well, we can do it all the way that you and I are having this conversation, to which I say, no. And in fact, we are very diligent to make sure that my entire team is together twice a year, which may not be enough, but it's for some of the reasons that you're describing. Like as great, as better that what you and I are doing right now is than being on the phone. And it's way better. It's not the same. It'll never be the same as us being in the same room.
Right, exactly. We are human beings. And again, as AI and automation and new communication platforms evolve, maybe we'll get to the point where we can interact just as effectively, but we're not there now. So
and not for the foreseeable future, I don't think, right? Even as things change, I mean, I'm certainly open to that. But as we're talking about this today, and as you're listening to us now, that's not the world that we yet live in. So
that's right.
So you all have put together a model and a process, and clearly there are steps in it that people wouldn't necessarily do if they don't know your model or aren't working with you. I get that. But if you just look at people in general or organizations in general when they're trying to solve a complex problem sort of without guidance, what's an area that you think they drastically mess up, or a step or two that they really truly miss?
Well, I would say it's right from the beginning, articulating your challenge clearly. We use questions for that, but just loading up a question with everything that matters, throwing in a stretch goal and end dates and things like that, but just taking the time to put it to paper, to document what it is you're trying to solve. That itself, you wouldn't believe the amount of time we spend on that because it's so important. You also, having done that, then need to kind of get buy-in. Often there's a core team or colleagues around the leader that's convening people. Just trying to get people aligned on the statement of the challenge is, it's a very valuable step, and it's a step people don't take the proper amount of time to do, usually. People do not bring variety together in the way that we describe variety very often. And there's some courage there. It might mean customers coming into conversations that might get fairly vulnerable, partners, people from other parallel industries who have been through a similar kind of challenge, and not bringing them in to present or to offer a case study, but bringing them into the conversation as an equal participant. Engaging
in the ways that you just described.
That's right. Because again, when do we ever have access to those kinds of people in a conversation? So if you actually think about sort of the 10 most interesting viewpoints that you've encountered on your challenge, imagine getting them all into a room together with your people and giving them a process where everybody has to listen and speak and engage. Magic happens. And so when we are actually building groups, when we're working with leaders who are doing this, we spend a lot of time. We let them sort of put the usual suspects down. Then we challenge the number of usual suspects that they have, because it's usually political. And we say, okay, how can you better use those seats?
Perfect. So we're going to make a shift here, everybody. We're going to go to what we call the fast break, part of the conversation. And the fast break is brought to you by our Remarkable Way process, which is a way for leaders to be on an ongoing path of growing and becoming the leader they were born to be. You can learn more about that. Sign up for an upcoming a list for some upcoming content around that by going to remarkablepodcast.com/way. So I have 3 words for you in the fast break. David, I have 3 words, and I'm just going to share a word. I want you to tell us whatever your initial thoughts are about it. No right or wrong answers, of course. And just sort of what would you share with us from your perspective, based on your journey, based on your work, related to these 3 ideas, okay?
Yep.
Number 1, expectations.
Setting expectations is absolutely vital. So what I've learned over the years is when you go through the formula, first of all, when you're held back from solving anything and you're asked to sit and patiently listen to other people's perspectives on things and their experiences, it's very frustrating. And we can spend an entire day of several days together just doing that. And so I will always set the expectation at the beginning of the day. You're going to be frustrated by the end of the day, and you're going to tell me that you feel further from answers. And when I started doing that, setting those expectations, it actually does a much better job of convincing people they're experiencing a formula. We know what we're doing, and they are feeling the way they should feel.
And that's okay. And guess what? When they're all done, they're going to say, hey, that was really, really helpful. We had to do that step, and the fact that you helped us with that was useful too.
Exactly.
Second word, strategy.
We are engaging the formula in situations of strategy all the time. And strategy, again, I do not have an MBA, so I really had to grope my way towards understanding strategy as I was in business and as I was growing up in my career. And I think it's a word that comes with a lot of heavy load for people who aren't usually engaged in strategy. And that's because they're not usually engaged in strategy. But when you open up strategy to the talent around you and to people who don't usually get a chance to participate, you are making them so much better. They are gaining so much. And what is surprising to people is how much you are gaining by including them in the strategic process. So strategy is not a play-at-home game. It's something that should be done in an arena with many people involved.
And my third word today is coaching.
So coaching, again, is something that I don't put a box around coaching in terms of my experience with it. I don't think of myself as a coach. I'm told afterwards that people really felt that they got some coaching value. But if I'm not talking about me and that word, and I'm thinking about the formula, what's interesting is the critic role. When people forget what it was called, that role where you're listening and challenging, they refer to it as the coaching role. And I think for anyone who does play a coaching role, that's an important insight in terms of recognizing that what people value in coaches is often the challenge, the bluntness, the critique, not the, hey, that was great, that was fantastic. Although that's nice to hear too.
Looping it back to expectations, that all works better because you're very clear with people about what's expected of them and others knowing what's expected of them, because conflict typically happens when people have unclear or unmet expectations. And so by you setting that all up on the front end for people, they're much more willing to open up to what's being said because they know that's what was being asked of them to do, right? And I think that's an important piece as well. So shifting gears, thank you for the fast break. This is the piece, David, that I think if my guests know that it's coming because they've listened to past episodes, they are fine with it. But oftentimes when I tell them, they're like, "Oh, I'm not sure about this." But I appreciate your insights and connecting it to your experiences was exactly what I was hoping would happen. So thank you for that. I've got just 2 or 3 more questions for you, David. One of them is about we hinted at this in my introduction of you, but what is it that you do for fun?
I run. I actually spend a lot of time with my daughters, and I've sort of got 2 generations of daughters, one who's 9 and a couple in their mid-20s who are just at the tail end of their formal educations. So we play board games. We just enjoy each other's company. I run half marathons when I can do that. And if you look over my shoulder at Toronto, you'll see it's not always easy to get out and train. But in fact, this is the best time of year.
Not so much. On the day that other people can start to hear this, maybe you
That's
can
right.
on that day. Although the launch of a book week, you may need a run, but you're going to be busy that week.
And what's really interesting,
right?
Yeah. So just to finish on the what do I enjoy? I am a voracious reader, but I almost want to say that in past tense. because over the last couple of months, as we've been anticipating the book launch, I decided it was time to start paying attention to podcasts. So I have become a voracious consumer of podcasts, and I'm loving every minute of it. Malcolm Gladwell was probably the first one that I listened through, revisionist history, and I was hooked. So really enjoying that lately. And books are a love as well. It's just I'm finding less time for the books, and what I've had to leave behind entirely because of podcasts now is sports, and paying attention to what's going on in the sports news.
There you go. So I am going to ask you what you're reading. So what is something that you're reading now, even though you're now listening to podcasts and you've already given us revisionist history as one? What is it that you're reading?
I'm actually, my favorite genres are science fiction and historical fiction and fantasy to some degree. Probably, I'll mention Armageddon by Leon Uris, which is about Berlin right after the war. And the reason I picked that up, I don't know if you've read anything by Uris, but just fantastic stuff. I picked that up because I was in Berlin a year and a half ago, and in that same problem-solving mode, I felt that there was something about the city that I wasn't quite able to put my finger on. So it really stuck with me for a while. I couldn't quite understand what I was experiencing when I was in the city because it wasn't overt. It was just a feel. So at some point I saw somebody reading Armageddon. I saw it was Berlin after the war. I picked it up, and it did a great job of really filling in that gap of understanding of how that city, 60 years ago went through what it went through and why I was feeling what I was feeling when I was there 60 years later. Cool. I guess 70 years later. Yeah.
So do you have another podcast, maybe one that people might not have heard of, that you recommend to people?
I'm sure they've heard of it. I'm just working my way through the various years of Radio Labs and loving every minute of that. My daughter has a podcast, and she has one episode out, and I listened to that. Quite enjoyed it.
Okay, whoa. What is it? We need to know.
I was afraid you'd ask because I cannot tell you. She works in a game institute, so it's actually on games and gaming. So it was fascinating. She revealed. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm going to ask you, David, to try to get that to us, and we'll make sure everybody it's in the show notes so that we can give your daughter and her podcast some love.
Excellent.
A little bit. We would love to do that. So the question we've been talking with David Benjamin about his brand new book, along with David Komlos, Cracking Complexity. Where can we learn more about your work and get in the book and all that stuff, David?
The website is crackingcomplexity.com. I've got a Twitter handle now, ComplexityDB for David Benjamin. Facebook, Cracking Complexity is there as well. And we're happy to encounter you wherever you encounter us.
Perfect, including LinkedIn, where we connected earlier today. So so thank you for that, and thank you for this really enlightening and enjoyable conversation. Now for all of you listening and watching, the question as always is, now what? What are you going to do with this? Before you get your copy of the book, there are all sorts of practical things for you to consider, even without all the whole 10-step model. And whether that's thinking about how you craft some conversations differently with some members of your team, whether that's thinking about who might you bring together for a problem. And certainly it could be about how do I craft better questions and better lead-ins to solving the problems, complex or otherwise, that we have in front of us. There was plenty here for you to take action on, but you've got to decide what it is that you're going to take action on. I hope that you'll do exactly that. So David, thanks again for being here. It was a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. And everybody, we're here every week, so come on back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.